Tonight, we have a very special guest here, Ben Levin. For those of you who heard the story before, I'm sorry, you'll have to put up with it one more time. But when I was a young whippersnapper, kind of a real pain in the ass as a youth. Ben was a teacher of mine at Temple University, and that must have been like 1973 or something like that.
Somewhere in there.
And, Ben at the time was a graduate student at Temple University. And, there were a lot of good students there, but Ben was clearly the one that everybody looked up to. And I was really fortunate to have my first documentary film production class with him. And I made this film in his class about this kid going through a documentary. And if I ever find that footage, I would love to finish it. Ben had a great career before he moved to Texas, but then moved to UNT and did a really incredible job teaching undergraduates. And then I think, if I remember correctly, you were pretty responsible for developing the MFA program, which is a really important part of what's going on in the region, because there was no MFA program in documentary in the Southwest at all. And it's a hard thing to do. Started small, built, and now it's a very, very strong and incredibly powerful program. But now Ben is retired and he's living out in Taos, and so we convinced him to come and guest host with me, talking about the fog of war. And I have to say, there's a very good chance that I will, instead of saying fog of war, say the fog of truth, which is my podcast. And it just so happens that about 2 hours ago, I did an interview with Errol Morris for the podcast. And we'll talk a little bit about the things that he mentioned when we get to that. So Ben, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, and I am splitting time still between Denton and out here. It's just with the COVID stuff going on, I'm probably spending more time out here than I ever have. But still looking forward to being back in that region again soon, I hope.
So
this is partly based on the fact that we had almost a foot of snow here on Monday. So after digging out of that in October, it's going to be back to normal soon.
So why did you choose this film, or did you choose this film?
I did.
Yeah, and why did you choose that?
Well, I was very fortunate in that in my later years at Temple, I was able to teach 2 courses on a single documentary filmmaker, one on Frederick Weissman, the seminar, and one on the films of Errol Morris. I was able to do the Errol Morris film class, I think 4 times. So while there's been a 3 or 4 year gap since I did it, it was an incredible experience. And I think I'm going to say something parenthetically. I think Fog of War, I still feel, is his best film, best work. Wouldn't want to categorize it that rigidly, but let's say a very strong work by a very important filmmaker. And seeing it in the context of all of his other work, or much of his other work, was important as well. And having revisited the film recently now, I feel even more strongly about that for a variety of reasons.
So how do you feel differently rewatching it recently as opposed to when you initially watched it?
Well, unfortunately, with any film, there are some key things that you remember that seeing it the first time are revelations. The seatbelt invention. Now, how many other people were involved in that is unclear in the film, but certainly he was involved in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you see the film the first time, you go, shit, the seatbelt. I mean, killed a bunch of people in World War II, but he invented the seatbelt, blah, blah, blah. Well, having seen the film early on, you remember that. So when you see the film again, you know, oh, that's right. Now, I don't remember exactly where that is going to come into play here, but from a standpoint of dramatic structure, it's very important. It's not an accident that it's where it is in the film. It's very important placement of that revelation because the film, of course, is structured out of chronology,
Right.
which I think is very important for this film. So there are just a lot of things about this film that I think things that he was developing in the early part of his career that come. I was saying this to somebody earlier today. It's a very sure-handed film, and
Yeah.
whether you like some things about it or don't like some things about it, he has really developed, in particular, ways of using archival footage in conjunction with the, to be crass, talking head.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very important film for all of those reasons, aside from the obvious importance of the content.
And it's really, having watched that, and also I watched American Dharma recently and watched them kind of back to back. Both are films about important people who have shaped politics in a very kind of real way, but stylistically they're so different because in American Dharma you have the set that he put him in, but also there are sort of the Errol Morris films where he has the Intellitron and people are looking directly at the camera. When I say the Intellitron, do all of you know what I'm talking about? How many of you do not? Has anybody put their hand up, don't know what I'm talking about?
The Interatron. Yeah.
Teratron, excuse me. Okay.
I
So
don't know.
do you want to explain the Teratron, Ben?
Oh, okay, sure.
You're the
By the way,
you're my teacher.
I think the title for this contraption of sorts was invented by his wife, and I think it's a combination of interrogation and electronics.
Hmm.
Interatron. I think I'm close to being right on that, but I know the interrogation part of it is definitely some of what she had in mind. And some people have suggested it may be suggesting something about their relationship too, and that it was her way of sort of getting to him in some ways. But it's basically what would be like a teleprompter, but it's done in a way so that the subject looks directly at the lens and sees Errol Morris's image, and he's not there. Now he varies this during the course of his career. Sometimes he's nearby, sometimes he's in another room, sometimes he's in some other position, but he's not right there. Now they can hear his voice. And if you notice with A Fog of War in the earlier section of the film, it sounds like he's yelling at McNamara, and eventually that gets softened. And it's almost as though if in fact the interview was chronological, that he was still figuring it out. In fact, the framing of McNamara early in the film is off camera.
Yeah.
But eventually it kind of settles down. I think it was Robert Chappelle who shot all of the interviews. So the Interatron is this invention of his, and he's done some variations on it as the technology has changed. In fact, when he did the first person series, he actually used something called the Megatron, which was a whole wall of mini DV decks hooked to different cameras, and he experimented with that. I think fortunately he gave up on that experiment as time went on, but that was part of the difference with that particular program and format. So that's what it is. It's pretty unique. And the debate goes on about whether people should look directly in the camera or a slight angle off and so on. I like the direct gaze myself.
It's just a different directorial approach. But what's interesting is that the in American Dharma and in Wormwood particularly, there are cameras all over the place, and so the idea of the Interatron, where you're looking straight at somebody, there's cameras from below and above and all over there. I think he said there were like 18 cameras in Wormwood, which is kind of insane to do an interview. But it's a very different, sort of way of interviewing somebody, and it comes off with something
So that's a variation on the Megatron, which
Yeah.
he's now brought into work for that kind of television format, Wormwood being a series, which
Yeah.
it shouldn't have been, in my opinion. And I'm sure Earl didn't want it to be a series either. And then again with American Dharma, which some of that may have been the demands of Banyan's people in terms of how they wanted that to be done. But I don't.
I think what he said today is that he was so enamored with the set that he built for that film that he wanted to really showcase that set. And so I think the visual style was all about showing that off. That's what he said today. Who knows what that really means? So you want to talk about the sort of structure of the film, that this was based on these 11 um, 11 elements and structured in that way. Do you think that works? Because
Well,
as you said, it's not linear, but thematic.
well, I think if you work without narration, which obviously he always has, then something has to be there to carry on the continuity. And so with him, I think using this structure freed him. Now, at what point they made a decision about that, I don't know. I know that Karen Schmier, who was his major editor on a lot of his films until she died tragically in an automobile accident in 2010, I believe it was, that she had quite an impact on helping him to organize material and finding ways to organize material. And so the chapters, if you will, those headings, they do give us a sense of theme. So a narrator doesn't have to say blah, 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 blah. This is the category that we're going to be exploring. The chapter heading sets that up. And with this film, maybe it's because I've seen it more than once, I almost felt during this recent viewing that they weren't even necessary, but that's probably because of multiple viewings. So what happens is that the chronology becomes irrelevant. What's become relevant are the ideas. And the ideas I think, are very important ideas. I had the list of chapter headings here earlier, and then I thought, well, I don't even want to look at those right now because that's in the film. And I sometimes they work really well, and sometimes I'm not sure. I think what is important is that they found a way with all of this diverse material to give the film a really strong sense of continuity. When they go back to 1918, that's a little short. And in terms of the overall pacing of the film, I felt like, well, if we were going to go there, maybe a little more. Of course, the discussion about the flu epidemic and so on at that time is very relevant to what we're all experiencing now. But so that structure, the chapter headings, and then the epilogue. And my understanding is it was Karen Schmier, one of his editors on the film, who said, you've got to do this. We've got to do this. And I think in terms of an editor, she felt there needs to be some kind of, the people are going to have too many questions about the rest of the film. So the epilogue, first time I saw the epilogue, I thought it was terrible, inappropriate. Are you trying to just get one more chance to butcher this guy? And of course, he doesn't let them do it, but his answer, his response helps. So the epilogue structurally, to get back to that, is kind of still a little wacky for me, and the way he's framed and so on, I'm not sure that, but obviously she won that argument if there was in fact a debate. I think the structure though also is in part the way it is because we don't want to watch all of the wars at once, all right? You can't really, so finding a way to position his move to Ford with a kind of vague suggestion as to all of the reasons why that happened financially, paying the bills for his wife's hospitalization with polio. But it kind of works because it sets up why Kennedy would be interested in somebody like this. Well, he's had experience with war, he's had experience with data collection, he's been successful in business, and maybe he would be a buffer with the military, remembering in those days Eisenhower's caution about the military industrial complex. And so here you have somebody who has experience with both, but he's not a military person. So the placement of these things is really interesting. And I think that the Vietnam segment, which is what he's most remembered for, if people haven't seen the film or read any of the biographical material about him. So as filmmakers, they had to make decisions about structure, which I think were, for the most part, very intelligent decisions, and took a lot of work. I'm sure this isn't something you just write up a script and slam it together. This took a lot of thought.
Yeah.
And I
He had
think
20 hours of material of the interview. 20 hours.
shot, by the way, 24p HD
Right.
video.
Yeah.
Right. And they had to release it. I'm mentioning this because I think it's important in terms of his style of interviewing, to move away from structure for a moment.
Yeah.
Another film where this occurred, another film that qualified for an Academy Award, it didn't win, was a film called Union Maids in the mid-70s, which was all the interviews were shot with half-inch video portapacks, combined with archival footage and released on film, and it qualified for Academy Award consideration.
Very good.
Earl's film was shot, all the interviews were shot on video for a variety of reasons, partly because it meant that he could let people tell their stories, which is part of his technique, and let them go on and on and on as long as they needed to. But it was, the whole thing was released, fixed on film for release, and it won the Academy Award. And I mention this in part because there's an ongoing debate at the Academy Award right now about what to do about all of the digital stuff coming forward, et cetera. But it was interesting that that as early as the mid-70s somebody did this. But Earl doing it was an important decision to enhance, if you will, his interview style, which is, when possible, to let people tell their stories. Didn't work so well with Rumsfeld later on.
Yeah. Because
he knew what he was going to say and what he was willing to say and not be willing to say. It's very different with McNamara. So anyway, structurally, that's just general what I think. But I also think the decision to do the interviews on HD video was impacted all of this.
So, what do you think? How do you think that Morris thinks about McNamara? What is your sense of his perspective on McNamara, which is complex?
It's very complex. First of all, I think looking at this in the context of his other films, one critic called it the interest in studies in rationalization. You do a certain number of things in your life, and this is true of many of his single person characters. And for me, the strongest films are films about individuals. Maybe Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control is a film about 3 or 4 individuals, but still, that's where he places himself, and he's curious. Remember, he worked as a private investigator, a private detective, when he was trying to find the money to finish Gates of Heaven. It was mainly corporate private eye work that he did, but he's interested in getting at the bottom of why somebody did something that they did, or why they believe in something that they're doing. So I think McNamara fascinated him in that way, and I believe this project started as a shorter interview show for his first person series.
Right, he did.
And there were 2 or 3 of his films that actually started that way, or started initially as that being a possibility, and then expanding it from there. So does he like McNamara? I don't know. Is he sympathetic, empathetic? I think there's a lot involved there, and he's dealing with an 85-year-old person who is pretty incredibly articulate about things, like her or not, and his rationale. And I think that's why did you do this would be the big question for him, which is what, in a sense, they're trying to explore in the epilogue, but for me, doesn't really work. So what does he think? When you place things in a film that shows someone in a good light, and I'm going to come back to the safety belt. And I know there are a lot of people who still don't believe we should be forced to wear safety belts, just as they don't believe we should be forced to wear masks during this time that we're in. But having said that, a lot of lives were saved by the use of safety belts. Well, does that, no, that doesn't justify what happened during World War II that he had a major role in, nor does it justify in any simplistic way what happened in Vietnam. I think if Earl respects him for any reason, it's because he was willing to talk about this and he was willing to admit that he had made mistakes. And I think there's something that fascinates Earl about people who are intelligent. In fact, I think he has something of an obsession about IQs, which I can get back to in a minute. But to focus on this particular film, I think that McNamara fascinates him as a character. And I think there are some things he really likes about him, and there are things that he finds really problematic. And I think the structure of the film does communicate that. There is a tension there about, gee, I really would like to like this person, but he did that. He made that decision. He recommended that. And it's sort of like treating a war like you would, getting the Ford Motor Company up to speed with the other large automobile makers. That's a hard one, and I don't have. I will share one story though, personal story. During all of this that was going on in Washington, and when McNamara was being really crucified by the press, and it was ongoing. It was every day. I happened to be living in Washington, D.C., and I remember I used to go to on Sunday mornings to see the avant-garde films at the Janus Theater on DuPont Circle. And one Sunday morning, I went to the films, and I came out and I went into the bookstore on DuPont Circle, and there he was, browsing for books, while he was being crucified by the press. And I never forgot that. Now, there probably was Secret Service or whatever outside, but in the bookstore itself, I didn't stare at him for very long, but I knew it was him. And he was going about his life, despite the pressure he was under. And that was probably attractive to some people who needed a person like him to be a part of their operation, whether it's Ford Motor Company, or putting together that young group of people for the bombings in World War II, or whether it was the Kennedy administration and later Johnson, who wanted him on staff for a variety of reasons. So it's complicated. And I think Earl probably had very mixed views of him, finding some of what he was responsible for to be inexcusable and despicable, but also something about him that intrigued him in other ways.
And so I actually asked him a couple of hours ago, and he pretty much said that he was really intrigued by him and really kind of enjoyed it. In fact, said, we got to be friends. He had him over to his house for dinner twice. And one time he like fell down and banged his head and was okay. But and then he said, but 20 years ago, I hated his guts. But now he's come to the point when he's sort of come to terms with him, which I think is really interesting. I wonder if you want to talk about the scene when he goes back to Vietnam and meets with the leaders in Vietnam, because to me, the whole Vietnam story sort of like comes to a peak at that moment, because that's when you understood how they got everything wrong.
Well, it's an awkward scene in the sense that it really relies heavily on what he has to say about it. And Earl doesn't like to do that in quite that fashion, but obviously the footage was minimal. How much footage are you going to get in an event like that? And you don't really know what people are talking about anyway. And when he says, and we almost came to blows, Well, they're just sitting there, and this colleague from Vietnam looks like a glass of wine, which he's either drinking or not drinking, and McNamara may have a beer sitting there, which he's drinking or not drinking. Well, I remember a book that was really important for me that I read in late high school or junior college. I can't remember exactly. Edward Hall's The Silent Language, talking about how miscommunication just visually by people dealing with other cultures, that X means one thing in one culture and Y in another culture. But that was huge. And I have a hard time dwelling on that scene for very long because it's scary as hell, because stuff like that's still going on. And those kinds of gross miscommunications, either by design, and we're seeing a lot of that these days, or by accident. And it's a chilling scene to me. But it's one of the weaker scenes visually, obviously, because the back of the heads, and so I'm sure that they discussed that in post-production and said, what should we, how do we do this? We got to get it in here, but we only have this little bit of stuff. Whereas for the other material, they had zillions of footage of archival stuff that somebody had to go through and help select things, which for the most part is done quite meticulously. But yeah, that scene is I think, really pivotal to the film. But the placement of it, it's like, how weird is this? We've heard about all of these things that transpired, and then here's this scene that says, oops, people just didn't understand each other. But structurally it works because of what they had to say about understanding the Russians during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. It's set up really beautifully well from the very beginning when you talk about, right, they didn't understand. It was all, or we would understand what they thought because empathizing with your enemy and understanding them. Set it up as a very important part of that. And then that's indeed the piece that you set up in the beginning that pays off about what really was the biggest problem with how things went terribly wrong in Vietnam.
I know that people are probably going to want to submit some questions via chat there, but there was something I wanted to mention, because I worked with an editor once who talked about flinch points. And the flinch point being, you're watching a film and you're going along and all of a sudden something happens that doesn't happen anywhere else in the film, and you can't figure out why the hell it's happening. Now, he jump cuts the interviews with McNamara. He lets you know early in the film that he's going to do that, because he does it a lot. And it may be because the early interview material warranted that or whatever, but it's there. And then sometimes he'll go to black and then come back up and then do some more jump cutting during the interview. But there's one scene, the beginning of lesson 5, where he's asking him about, why did you really need to use incendiary bombs on Tokyo? Now the shot is close up of McNamara teary-eyed. And the shot is only there for Morris's question. And then we cut to the answer and the tears are not there. That was a flinch point for me. That was one of those things like, we got to do this because we have this shot, and he's emotional. You don't see that much in Morris's film. There's a consistency. Once you get into the stylistic limitations that they've set for themselves, including the editor in that equation, it's pretty damn consistent. Just an interesting moment for me, and a little annoying, because it's almost like I'm feeling like, Earl, you didn't really have to do that. This is already, it's already there. And that was a way of, communicating something that I felt wasn't necessary right at that point, at least in terms of how he was using film techniques, because the film is so immaculate for the most part that way, and consistent, and gives the viewer a chance to say, okay, I can go with this. I can really watch and listen to what's going on, because again, I used this term earlier, this is a really sure-handed piece of filmmaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's very incredibly well put together. This film was added to the film registry.
Mhm.
Do you want to talk about that? Because I think you know something about the National Film Registry.
Well, no, I serve on the National Film Preservation Board.
Yeah.
But
Talk about that a little bit, about what that is, because most people don't even know
well,
it exists.
there's a lot of information if you just look up National Film Registry, Library of Congress, and it gives you the whole history of it. But there are about 50 of us on the board, 25 members and 25 alternates, and we meet once a year in Washington. This year it'll be virtual in a couple of weeks, and we discuss recommendations to the Librarian of Congress. Each year chooses 25 films for the National Film Registry. An interesting mix of documentary, a little bit of experimental, archival-based Hollywood movies. The idea being that the films be significant culturally, aesthetically, or historically, for whatever reasons are brought to the fore. So now we've been doing this for 30 years. So there are a lot of films now, I guess 750 and so on, but there's so many films and so many pieces that warrant attention. And it's interesting because several years ago, I think Hearts and Minds was selected, and I thought, it was appropriate that she selected Fog of War last year, because I felt there's such a difference between Hearts and Minds being so close to the close of the war, being a really angry, sort of vicious attack on things. I remember the one shot in Hearts and Minds of the bomb doors opening on this B-52 with the bombs about to come out, and then a cut to Johnson during a press conference and something like that. And now this film, many years later, is an example of a film that contains more reflection, both on the part of the people or the person being focused on in the film, but all the rest of us. We have more knowledge, we know more about the intricacies of what happened, and so on. So, yeah, so that's that. We meet once a year, and the librarian listens to the discussions, and we have study groups that study various genres and submit our ideas, and then discuss them at the meeting, and then eventually she'll submit her selections, usually at a press conference early in December.
And I have to say that the selections are really diverse, and they're not Hollywood movie. I mean, there's some, but it's a very good collection. I think it's something that's really interesting in the way that this is what we are preserving. I kind of like think of it as like all the great cultural pieces that you would send out in outer space, so that a million years from now, when somebody finds it, if they have a playback device, they can understand what our culture is and what important.
Yeah, I think it's been a great experience for me over time. But
So,
yes, Fog of War was selected last year.
so what else do you want to talk about on the film before we take some questions? I mean, there's so many issues here to sort of get at.
Just a moment, just real quick on Philip Glass, because I was a professional musician before I changed careers. There are a lot of opinions about his music, but I feel like what it does here, you've got all of these diverse elements, the archival footage, the talking head interviews, the music just pulls all of that together. I think that's what Earl likes about it. So you get a theme moving through in the music, and then you cut to these other stylistic entities over the music. So you have this feeling that there's a nice smooth continuity to this, and very often I guess there is, but the music helps you through that experience, and it also suggests, yes, there are relationships between all of these things. The guy putting that bomb in that plane, well, it may not be the bomb that they're not talking, the specific bomb that was dropped in the situation they're speaking to, but the music just says, okay, all of these diverse elements are related. Now it's interesting, there's a second composer that's given additional music credit. I'm not sure what it is, but there are several times in the film when something dire is about to happen, and suddenly there's this bluesy-like music that's very different from the rest of it. I don't know whether that's Glass or the other person, but that's used in another way. That's used to set up, oh, here we go. They're going to do something bad again. And so the music, I think, is very important. By the way, this film was, this re-recording sound mix was done by Lee Dichter, who
Really?
was one of the great re-recording sound mixers, all of Woody Allen's films, Harlan County, USA, a number of other documentaries without big budgets, etc. So that really, I think, enhanced blending all of these elements together by having the re-recording mix done by something of his, somebody of his caliber and experience.
He mixed my thesis film in graduate school.
There you go. He's a
Indeed.
legend.
Indeed, it was amazing to have him work on my film. It was like amazing. But I think the music, that Philip Glass music, has a kind of lyrical sense that ties it together, but it also has this rhythmic sense that moves it forward, that gives a kind of energy to it. And you know, I think, you know, that Errol Morris sort of knows how to work that music really well. I mean, he's learned like what a Philip Glass score and how it can change the tempo and the tenor of a scene and help the film structurally, I think, as well. And I think that
And
was,
it is true. If you look at the first person series with Errol Morris, and I'll just do this quickly because I'm real interested in that series. It was real clear whether he liked somebody or didn't like somebody. Okay. And there was a guy who claimed to be, and other people suggested he was one of the most intelligent people in the world, and maybe the most intelligent person in the Western world, who worked as a bouncer in Bozeman, Montana, right? Now, he didn't like this guy, but this guy was, you know, he was somewhat convincing. It was creepy. So, again, getting back to his feelings about McNamara, I think he, like is too simplistic a word, but he was empathetic. I guess maybe I'm more comfortable with that.
yeah, I think he come to terms with why he did what he did, and the sort of nature of those decisions, and for him to at least understand the mistakes. And I think that was kind of important. I mean, and it's important to sort of remember that, for people of a certain generation, like, being against the Vietnam War was like a very visceral thing for all of us who lived through that moment. It's like that sort of defined many years of our lives. I imagine, in the same way that teenagers will, you know, deal with the Trump years when they think about it, you know, this was very important to the way we saw the world. It was definitely a lens that Vietnam bad, right? I mean, for those of us who were remember that those years. So do we have any questions from anybody? I mean, I've got plenty of other things I could ask, but any of you have any thoughts or questions about the film, how this sort of played to you? Leslie, it looks like you want to say something. You have to unmute yourself, Leslie.
No, I was just looking at the chat while you said that.
Oh, okay.
I didn't have anything specifically, but thank you.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
I do have an unimportant question.
Okay.
Toward the beginning of the film, when there's all the naval scenes, they all look like they were World War II, not Vietnam. Was I wrong on that?
I think early on they're World War II, and I'm trying to remember how that played. It didn't really bother me, but I'd seen the film before, so I kind of knew. Mm-hmm. I think they were trying to set up it's a sort of the premise of the film, or what was going to be involved. Yeah, but that footage was, in fact, a lot of World War II footage, of course, was shot on 35, small 35 cameras. And so some of that footage is just immaculate. And technically, from a technical standpoint, it grabs you. It looks like it's going to be that kind of a movie that's going to have really footage that was cared for and in a particular way. Later, some of the archival footage doesn't quite hold up as well, but
well, I thought it was good footage, but it just seemed out of time.
Speaking of footage like that, what did you think of the way when he talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, you have like that magnifying glass going over like the still images? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, there are a number of techniques like that that are used, both manipulating existing archival footage,
Right.
slowing it down. They do that a lot, but also the footage that was shot by, I can't remember his first name now, but Donahue. The stuff they shot, the dominoes were
The
particularly.
dominoes are the key thing.
And Bart, you must remember, uh, when you were at Temple, the two students who made the film about the guy at University of Pennsylvania who would, as an event, set up 10,000 dominoes, and then
Oh,
they filmed it, and he liked them a lot, so he did it like they were able to do it 10 times to get the different angles because they only had one camera. So when I look at that shot, I get a little like weird, but it's the domino scene is set up very meticulously, but it's kind of weak for me in a way. It doesn't when you put a scene like that in the film with the dominoes. By the way, I think the testing of the skulls for the seatbelts, that really works for me.
yeah.
All right, clinking down through the stairwells, but the dominoes, that's, well, to use the word flinch point again, except that you see them several times, that you just keep seeing them, and it's kind of like, okay, I get what they mean here, but I'm not sure stylistically that worked. But Earl's been struggling from the beginning of his career about what to do when you have to cut away to something.
Right.
So in Gates of Heaven, it's fairly primitive. And when he does do it, it is considering what he would evolve to, it doesn't work at all for me. Vernon, Florida, which is my second favorite Errol Morris film. I like Fog of War the best. Vernon, Florida is just, they would only give him so much, and he worked with, it's very minimalist. But then he began to hire art directors, and he began to hire people, specialists, to come into his films. It increased the budgets greatly, to come in and really pay attention to these other elements. And it gets us, really away from this whole B-roll concept, which
Right.
Anybody who's a former student of mine will know it's enough to have the paramedics come and pick me up if somebody uses that term, because it's just such a, it's a way of saying, well, just throw something in there to cover it. And Morris has fought against that and developed all of these ways to deal with that issue. And sometimes it works better than others. The dominoes don't work as well for me as the testing of the human skulls for the idea of packaging people in cars. So that's a real, when you have a film that's so heavily dependent on a talking head, then what you go to is very important. Otherwise, I feel it's disrespectful in a way to your subject, whoever the subject might be.
Can you specifically say what you mean by flinch point? I thought I knew, and now I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, I thought I knew how this structure was. I thought I knew how this film was being, what the editing rationale was for this film, and I'm very comfortable with it. And suddenly it's violated. Something different happens, and you go,
"Oh, like without him crying."
Why did they do that? Why did they do that?
Yeah. Like they jumped the shark.
Yeah, well, something like that. I mean,
to show him crying seemed important because he was trying to act tough, it seemed like, and there he showed emotion, and like he said that it seemed obvious why he said he would rather be a coal miner than a florist when he was tested on that at Ford.
Yeah.
And I guess that's because he wanted to be macho.
Well, I think for me there are several other times in the film when he is teary-eyed, and and it's in real time in a sense. What was a flinch point for me about the shot in question was that here's a shot of him teary-eyed, but now we go on with the interview, and that seemed to be used as a way for Earl to get the question in there, in part. Now, whether that's the reason or not, it was just a little bit of a, but there are only flinch points when somebody's basically got their act together.
Right.
And then they do something that's not a part of that. And like, it's not like a harsh criticism, or not intended to be. Just
right. If you're incompetent, it doesn't really matter. Yeah. Yeah. So, and the other thing, sort of thinking about the dominoes is, you know, if you don't remember much about the whole rationale of the Vietnam War was the domino theory, and they didn't even really mention it very much or talk about like why the dominoes were important. They just assumed that everybody sort of knew that and know what that was really sort of saying. And I think at one point one of them said, well, if one of them fall, they'll all fall. But that was like over and over again used as the basic justification for the war. And another one of these like pieces, visualizations, instead of calling them B-rolls. And indeed, you know, starting at Thin Blue Line, he got known for sort of very aestheticized visualizations. And I think that what sort of made that apart from other kind of documentaries.
I think that's very important, Bart, by the way.
Yeah.
Thin Blue Line was basically, even though it was shunned by the Academy because of the reenactments, that film liberated that as a possibility, for better or for worse. And sometimes it's for better and sometimes it's not, that reenactments were okay to be in a credible documentary. It's similar to Ken Burns and Civil War. Suddenly there was a kind of film that nobody would fund previously, and suddenly with the success of that. So I think the pioneering effort, and in fact, Fog of War is the first time the Academy really recognized him and his work. So yeah, the Thin Blue Line, and by the way, talking about Philip Glass, his music is used very differently in Thin Blue Line than it is in Fog of War, in my opinion. Two different kinds of films with very different content.
One of the things I noticed in watching this again was the close-ups of a tape recorder, which also are in Thin Blue Line, like at the end, a different kind of tape recorder. But the idea of seeing these dramatic shots of machinery playing back, it just seems like that happens in several of his films.
It is. It's reflexive of sorts. I mean, it's kind of, this is what we do. This is how we
Actually, I had a question about the tape recorder, because your was much more a European tape recorder. And at the time, the big tape recorder in the U.S. for a portable tape recorder was a Wallensack. I would have expected to see a Wallensack in there.
You know, Stephen, I actually also sort of noticed that, but I also know that Errol Morris is an incredible stickler for details. And I'm sure that he actually researched that and found the exact kind of model that would have been around at that time. Yeah, I mean, I noticed the logo on there, and it was surprising to me. Any other questions about anything you want to sort of talk about? There's so many things about him as a person that I think was interesting, that in a sense, he was kind of the first person who brought like numbers into the Defense Department and quantifying everything, which was kind of later became a way, which he did at Ford. It's like a whole sort of business model of making everything efficient, and sort of the idea that you could apply sort of numbers to warfare is kind of interesting. And there's that shot where like you're seeing the bombs and you're seeing all these things and you're seeing numbers kind of falling out. And I think that's another one of those great ways of visualizing what somebody is talking about in a very sort of powerful and meaningful way.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of effort into graphic design, and in his films, as he moves through his career up to this point in particular, and then beyond, a lot of attention's paid to that. How do you visualize something that this guy's talking about in a meaningful way? And
well, I have a little treat to show everybody if I can figure out how to make this work. I haven't done one of these in a while. So when I was talking to Errol Morris just a few hours ago, I asked him, we were talking about American Dharma. I said, you know, if Trump loses and he's no longer president, would you be interested in making a film about him and interviewing him? And which I thought was really interesting.
I already did.
And he did for, okay, I got to find, where do I have the screen? God, I should know how to do this. I've been using Teams, so I haven't been using, oh, screen share. It's right in front of me. Okay, so let's see if I can find this file. So when he was doing some videos for the Academy Awards, and he was interviewing all kinds of people about, when that's the wrong one. Okay, how about if I do the desktop? Okay, now I got to get this one on the desktop. Okay, can you see a shot of Donald Trump there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so so he was interviewing a whole bunch of people about films that meant something to them, and there were all kinds of people, and one of them was Donald Trump, and Donald Trump wanted to talk about Citizen Kane. So this is Errol Morris doing Donald Trump on Citizen Kane.
Foster Kane advice. What would you say to him?
Get yourself a different woman. A lot of people don't really understand the significance of it. I'm not sure if anybody understands the significance, but I think the significance is bringing a lonely, rather sad figure back into his childhood. The word rosebud, for whatever reason, has captivated moviegoers and movie watchers for so many years, and to this day is perhaps the single word. And perhaps if they came up with another word that meant the same thing, it wouldn't have worked. But rosebud works.
Rosebud works.
Right? For whatever reason. The word rosebud is maybe the most significant word in film and what we all watch. The wealth, the sorrow, the unhappiness, the happiness just struck lots of different notes. Citizen Kane was really about accumulation. And at the end of the accumulation, you see what happens, and it's not necessarily all positive. Not positive. I think you learn in Kane that maybe wealth isn't everything, because he had the wealth, but he didn't have the happiness. The table getting larger and larger and larger, with he and his wife getting further and further apart as he got wealthier and wealthier. Perhaps I can understand that. The relationship that he had was not a good one for him, probably not a great one for her, although there were benefits for her. But in the end, she was certainly not a happy camper. In real life, I believe that wealth does, in fact, isolate you from other people. It's a protective mechanism. You have your guard up, much more so than you would if you didn't have wealth. There was a great rise in Citizen Kane. And there was a modest fall. The fall wasn't a financial fall, the fall was a personal fall. But it was a fall nevertheless. So you had the highs and you had the lows. A lot of people don't really understand the significance of it. I'm not sure if anybody understands the significance, but I think the significance is bringing a lonely, rather sad figure back into his childhood. The word rosebud, for whatever reason, has captivated moviegoers and movie watchers for so many years, and to this day is perhaps the single word. And perhaps if they came up with another word that meant the same thing, it wouldn't have worked. But rosebud works
Rosebud works.
for whatever reason.
You know, if you could give Charles Foster Kane advice, what would you say to him?
Get yourself a different woman.
So there you have.
Lost it.
Art, I just wanted to say something here. If you go to Earl's website, his life is about a lot more than these movies that we see. He's a voracious reader, voracious curiosity about a lot of other things. And if you go to his website, of course, over the years, he's made a lot of commercials in order to survive, some really esoteric and weird and fun, and other ones just a lot of film for automobile companies, by the way. He's made a lot of money doing that. But he also has made a number of short films. He has what was a pretty active Twitter account. All of that's on the website. And one of the commercials he regrets having made was a commercial about that woman out of Stanford who supposedly had invented the one-drop blood test. And one of the few times I think Earl was embarrassed by something that he did, but because he was sort of conned by her. Some people have written that in any case, but he does a lot of other things, and he's interested in a lot of other things. And I think he brings that to bear on his work and the sophistication of it.
And Alex Gibney's film about her, he has a shot of Errol Morris in it. And I just thought it was very odd that Gibney would have purposely tried to embarrass Errol Morris by including that scene in the film, which I thought was rather bad taste. And he's an incredible person. I mean, his curiosity about things, and then, you know, these essays about these photographs and what happened are really kind of very powerful. And then he wrote this article about fonts, and if you write in, I think it was Baskerville, more people will understand what you're saying or respect it than if you do it in Helvetica. Or so I've used that font for everything ever since then. So I have to thank Errol Morris for that. Not that anybody can understand anything I write, but that's a whole nother story. Right. Anybody who's read my material knows what I'm talking about.
Bart, I don't know if anybody else has heard this, but I heard this many years ago, what Rosebud really meant in the film. And it was sexual. It had to do with a woman's anatomy, actually. Nobody else has ever heard that? I heard that years ago.
I just assumed it was always the sled that they're burning at the end that says Rosebud on it.
No, it was his private talk with his lover, wife, whatever.
Marion Davies. Yeah, I have heard this story. I know what you're talking about. Yeah. That it was William Hearst's private little pet name for part of Marion Davies' anatomy, and that's all I'm going to say.
That's what I heard too, but maybe it's a rumor. Who knows?
I've not heard that.
Bart, just briefly, to get back to what you said, because I think it's really important. Earl has a deep interest in what occurs outside the frame. And that's not only an aesthetic concept, it's a concept about, well, here's McNamara and here are all the headlines. What was happening outside the frame? And the book on still photography, where he addresses this, is fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Especially we're concerned what happened in the Iraqi prisons, or the US prisons in Iraq, the basis for standard operating procedure. And the impetus for that film was to find out what was behind, outside the frame of those terrible photographs that we saw. How did that happen? Why did it happen? What were the motivations, et cetera? And so I think it's a big part of his work.
So Ben, let me ask you one last question as we're getting to the 8:30 hour here. What does this film have to say to us today?
Well, it's watching it just recently here, it's very creepy. It's sort of like all humans are fallible. All humans make mistakes. To assume that the people we elect and place in office are not capable of mistakes and misjudgments, and sometimes small ones and sometimes huge. For me, it really speaks to that. And to trust anyone to the point of thinking that's not going to happen is a big mistake, in my opinion. And I think that's part of what Morris is cautioning us about. He's cautioning us about that in several of his films. You know, would you trust this person? And you know, to assume that because we elect someone to office means they're not going to make mistakes is difficult. Sometimes it's more obvious that somebody's making mistakes, and that's easy. What's hard is when it's subtler and when you can't really see outside the frame and see what's actually going on. And I think that this film is very strong that way. You have a concept of a person, and by the time you finish the film, you have a much richer sense of who that person is, like it or not. That's part of what he can do for us as viewers.
Ben, thank you so much. For those of you who have not heard Ben talk before, you've got a chance to see what it's like to take a class from Ben Levin. And you know, we're all very sorry that you're not teaching anymore, because you have the ability to tell these stories and to enlighten us. But the fact that you spent an hour with us today, we are really pleased and fortunate. And Ben, we miss you. So come back town, and hopefully we can get together in a socially distant way and talk some more.
We will, and I want to thank you personally for all that you do for the Dallas-Fort Worth media community and beyond.
Well,
it's very important work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And you shaped a lot of the way I see the world. So thank you.